Hello my loves, my name is Hannah and welcome to my May reading wrap-up. I read 15 books in May, which is creeping me out a little bit because that is now the third month in a row that I've read 15 books, and I'm not a person that appreciates consistency or symmetry. So I'm really hoping next month I read a different amount. Before I get talking to you about the books, well, firstly, the weather is nuts today. The sun keeps coming out and then going away. If the lighting state changes drastically during this video, sorry about it. Secondly, I thought before I talk to you about the actual books, I would do like a little brief statsy overview. I used to do these, or I started doing these at the start of the year, and then last time I did a reading wrap up, it was an enormous one because I was doing March and April together. And it just got too long and I didn't have time to do it. So we're bringing it back. So firstly, in terms of format, because I read across a few different formats. So I read, of the 15 books, 6 of them were paperbacks, so that's 40%. 5 of them, so that's a third, were audiobooks. 3 were ebooks, accounting for 20%, and then the final 6.6% is a hardback, one single solitary hardback. And in terms of the provenance, so where those books came from, 2 were library books, 2 were books from my physical TBR, so from my shelf of unread books that I had purchased secondhand from a charity shop. 2 of them were books from my physical TBR that I had purchased new, and 1 was on my physical TBR but was a book that had been sort of passed on to me. I don't know if you do this with your pals every so often, we'll just have a clear out of things and you just kind of take a book off someone's shelf. So 1 was that, so I hadn't bought it, but it was on my actual bookshelf. And then 5 of them were through my Everand subscription, and 1 was on Audible. I don't have an active Audible subscription anymore, but I have been slowly reading my way through books that I had already bought before I cancelled my subscription last year. So this was the last book that was on my Audible subscription. So that's where they were. Oh, and 2 were audiobooks that I listened to on BorrowBox from my library. So that's where I got my books from. Then in terms of other little bits, I have a nerdy spreadsheet where I track things. So a third of the books I read, 5 of them, were from independent publishers. Now, this is really hard to quantify, right? Because what do you count as an independent publisher? Do you go size? I am counting, for the purposes of this, any book that was not published by any of the big 4, so that's HarperCollins, Hachette, Macmillan, or Penguin, or any of their imprints. So 5 of the books I read were from nothing to do with those 4, and the other 10 were somehow from those big 4 publishers. It's interesting. I was hoping to look at this stuff more this year and let it guide my reading a little bit more, but as I will probably say a couple of times in this video, this Euros reading has really just it's the reading goal that has just got in the fucking way of everything else I wanted to do. But it's nearly finished, guys. It's nearly finished. So I'm really looking forward to actually being able to dig into some of the trends that I'm noticing in my reading, either to explore things that it seems I already am interested in, or to kind of self-correct if I feel like my reading is veering too much in a direction, or if I'm just overlooking things. And 1 is the indie presses. A third is good, but I would like that to be higher. And then genre, again, is a really difficult one because I, particularly this month, read so many crossover genres, but the most popular genre that I read this month was literary, which accounted again for a third of my reading. Then 20% were classics, that's 3 titles, 2 were memoir, 2 were kind of crime thriller, and then 1 each for speculative, historical, and myth retelling. Where do you count myth retellings? Do you put them in with historical, or do you count that as a separate genre? I guess it depends how many of them you read. I've got quite a lot of myth retellings. Then in terms of like looking at the diversity of what I'm reading, 7 of the books I read were translated, which again, not surprising given that I'm doing a challenge where I'm trying to read books from different European countries. I am really looking forward to keeping that quite high though. I really enjoy reading translated fiction, even if I will shortly be telling you about some translated books that I didn't like very much. In general, I really like reading translated work. And 5 of the books that I read had queer representation or were from queer authors. But the thing that I am really annoyed at myself and upset at myself about, is that only 1 of the books I read this month was from an author of colour, which doesn't feel good. And I will be doing better next month. I think that's why it's useful to look at things like this every so often, just to check in, because I hadn't realised that. I think I looked back through the other months of the year, and it had been much better, could be better than it has been, but I had been reading from a more diverse set of authors, and I just hadn't noticed this month. So that has been good. That has been useful. So in lots of ways, I've enjoyed my reading this month, particularly because I have been getting towards the tail end of the Euros challenge. I had a bit of a sprint finish with it. When we rolled into June, I still had 2 countries to tick off. As I'm recording this now, one of them is done, and I'm halfway through the final book. So next week's video is gonna be the Euros video, I think. And it would just be so funny if the content just doesn't fucking work after I've spent so many hours reading these books, but never mind. Right. Let's chat about the books, because, I have been talking for 10 minutes. Sorry about that. The first 4 titles I'm going to talk about, I'm hopefully not going to talk about in tons of detail, because I have already read them in my May Impatient reading vlog. I really missed doing the Impatient vlog in April. I was so happy to be doing them again. And I read some really good books in it. So the first one is The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. So Carson McCullers is an author who was writing in the mid-20th century. She's an American author. And this is the second title by her that I have read. And this follows a young girl, she's around 12 or 13 years old, who has just prior to the book's beginning, just met her brother, who's just returned home from a military posting, with his fiance, and it's the first time she's met her. And she basically has fallen sort of head over heels in love with the concept of this couple. So her brother and his fiance, and she becomes really, really invested in their upcoming wedding. It's going to be in a couple of days. And in some ways, the book is about that. And it's a really beautiful kind of coming of age tale. But it also is much bigger and broader than that, and taps into this sort of ageless and timeless sort of human condition of feeling like you are reaching for a life that is not available to you, or that you are uncomfortable sitting in your own existence and are constantly trying to like look into the outside world or the people around you to make sense of your life, or to bring meaning to your life, or to allow you to be the version of yourself that you think you ought to be. There was like lots of that stuff going through it. And the book itself is only 3 days. It only covers around 3 days. So a kind of condensed period of time right when she's obsessing about this wedding. And Carson McCullers is really clever with what she shows you and doesn't show you, and what kind of happens off the page. So we, for example, don't meet the brother and the fiance. That has happened prior to the book kicking off. We don't see the wedding, although we do hear about it afterwards. And that's really interesting because as a reader, it sort of robs you of your objectivity because we don't get to witness it firsthand. We're kind of reliant on having that experience be told to us secondhand through the characters. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and I really loved it. So that was a yay. And then the second one is actually a piece of non-fiction. This is Letter to My Daughter by Maya Angelou. And this is, so I hadn't ever read like a full piece of writing by Maya Angelou. I'd read like individual ones of her poems, but I'd never read like one cohesive piece of writing. So I was really looking forward to picking this up, and then realised this is not a cohesive piece of writing by design, but it's not, that's not what this is. So this is a sort of collection of writings. They are addressed, or the initial sort of introduction addresses these to Maya Angelou's daughter that she never had. So she had a son, but she didn't have a daughter. And they're sort of lessons that she has learned in life, and some of them are very clear, specific moments where she's going, this is where I learned something about this. And some of them feel very kind of light and anecdotal, and some are really difficult. A couple of them are very difficult, and particularly check the trigger warnings if violence against women, sexual assault is something that you need to be mindful of in your reading. Do check. And there is a little bit of poetry, and also some kind of like slightly wider political commentary, and some literary. So she was talking about like other literary influences. So it's a real mix of things, a real mixed bag. I mean, she's a poet, she's a beautiful writer. I did enjoy it. It wasn't quite what I wanted it to be. I thought it was going to be a bit more cohesive, but I still enjoyed it on the whole. And yeah, look forward to the one day where I do eventually read a cohesive piece of writing by Maya Angelou. And then the third book is a companion piece by Ali Smith. So I finally finished this little collection by Ali Smith, who is one of my favourite authors, in case you didn't know. So the Seasonal Quartet, in case you're not aware, were a cycle of 4 books that Ali Smith wrote, starting with autumn and then winter, spring and summer, and she wrote them over around a 4-year period. And the premise of the books was that she was very deliberately and specifically going to be writing about what was going on in the world at the time that she was sitting down to write. So very deliberately being incredibly responsive and open. And this is the final piece that she wrote to sort of wrap that series up. So the quartet as a whole has lots of references to Brexit, the pandemic, and kind of big social things that were going on at the time. And I've really enjoyed reading them. But I've said it before, and I will say it again, that I love the experience of reading Ali Smith's writing so much. Her novels, like reading her novels as like a reading experience, I find like I get some of the most like joy and excitement and like inspiration from reading her novels. However, I find them almost impossible to talk about. And I think that's because she's, as a writer, she's very abstract in sort of her approach to plot and story. It's not that nothing happens. It's not that these are like plotless books, although I mean, I do also quite like a plotless book. These have plot, and this book has plot, but it's sort of, she isn't very interested in starting at this point and taking you on this journey and landing you here at the end with a sense of a cohesive arc. And I think particularly for this cycle of books, because she's been responding to a world in which things are constantly in flux and in motion, I really feel like the books have captured that too. Like this idea that, So she'll start the book in a place and you'll think, oh, this is what the book's going to be about. And then she'll never come back to that again because she's followed something else that's kind of gone off over there. And this just continues to sit in the background. So in some cases, I think some people would find that really frustrating. And I can understand why. But I also think it's a very, very clever way of capturing, as I said, this sense of how do you create a meaningful narrative out of some of these really, like, could you write a plot by plot, this is how Brexit happened? I mean, I know lots of non-fiction writers have attempted to do that, but really, like, it's like, well, we could start here, but we could start back here, but we could start back there, but we could start back there. And I think that thematically, that's what she's doing in this book and in the cycle as a whole. And that is really all I can say about Ali Smith. I love her. I love her. And then the final book I read for that impatient reading vlog was a really short novel that I will put here or here. Where's there more space? Probably here. And that was Boulder by Eva Baltasar, which was translated from the Catalan by Julia Sanches. And this has sadly had to go back to the library. And I really enjoyed this one too. This is about an unnamed protagonist who has, at the start of the book, she's working as a chef on a ship. I had this issue in the vlog as well. What is that word that's not like commercial, not like a cruise liner, like a working ship, like a freighter ship or something? But she's working on one of them. And she has a very specific philosophy of life that's very simple. She sort of just thinks the key to a happy life is not being beholden to anyone, not submitting to any kind of external demands, just kind of going through life like water off a duck's back, just not kind of allowing yourself to be tied down or weighed down. And she seems, you know, to herself, she seems quite happy in that sense. And then she meets a woman, and at first you think, oh, it's just going to be another fling, because she's you know, sort of had various flings with women that she meets when the ships come into port. And you think maybe it's just going to be like another quick affair that she has, but she's not. She becomes obsessed with this woman. She falls completely in love with her. And this book is like the opposite of The Member of the Wedding in terms of how it approaches time and chronology, because like this covers, and this book is small. It's like 160, 170 pages, and it covers like a really quite significant amount of time, like years and years and years. So she meets this woman, falls in love with her, ends up agreeing to move to, is it Reykjavik? It's somewhere in Iceland, to move there with her, so to lay down roots and sort of shrug off this attitude to life that she'd had previously. And she has reservations about doing that, but sort of doesn't mind because she loves this woman. And then Samsa, her partner, decides she wants a child. And Boulder, by the way, Boulder is a name that Samsa has given our protagonist, like a nickname. So Boulder doesn't want children. She doesn't want children. It's like the definition of making yourself beholden, isn't it? Having a child. So like, she doesn't want to do that. But she is so scared that she's going to lose this woman that she's so in love with if she doesn't agree to have a child with her, that, you know, she sort of submits in the end. And so the book is really exploring these themes of like, to what extent compromise is okay when we're talking about real kind of core to us, how you want to live your life, the sort of life you want to live, like how much compromise is okay in a relationship, and how how much of ourselves can we give to someone else, or how much of ourselves can we change in order to make the people that we love happy, and to try and preserve a life that we think is making us happy. And I really loved it. I thought the writing was absolutely beautiful. I think it's not going to be writing for everyone. It's quite rich, and I don't think that's necessarily going to be to like everyone's taste, but I thought it was like beautiful. So that was those 4. So we're going to do the Euros books now. There's how many of them? 5, I think. The first one I read this month was my pick for Croatia, and this is We Trade Our Night for Someone Else's Day, which is by Ivana Bodrožić and was translated from the Croatian by Elias-Bursać. So this is described as a political thriller, and I wouldn't describe it as particularly thrilling, but it is definitely like political kind of like crime intrigue. And it's set in an unnamed city, but that is actually, oh my goodness, is it Vukovari? The translator's note explained it, but basically like it's unnamed in the book, but everyone knows the city that the writer is talking about. And that city is kind of on the outskirts of Croatia and used to be under Serbian control in the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia. And there was this massive, historically, in the past, there was a quite significant massacre that was carried out by the Serbian powers against the Croatian people, the Croat people that lived there. So that is like some history context for the book. But unfortunately, that history context was in the translator's note, which was at the end of the book. And I know I talk sometimes about introductions like spoiling things, but it would have been so helpful to have that context at the start of the book, just as a sidebar, like not the author's fault, but like that would have been real useful to have up front. So basically, all you need to know is that the city was formerly under Serbian control, is now under Croatian control, and that there is a huge amount of like bad blood there, and a lot of complexity and friction relating to national identity, just to contextualize. And so the book follows a journalist called Nora. She's from this city, left, and has just gone back for work for a brief visit because she's been asked to do this like puff piece and interview this woman who is currently serving a prison sentence after she's a teacher. And after she was allegedly having an affair with a 17-year-old student who then killed her husband. And she's in jail. And Nora's been sent to do an interview with her. But she's also she's also trying to uncover some mysteries in her own past. So her father disappeared when she was younger, and she's pretty convinced that he was killed by the people who are now in power in the city. So she's trying to work out what's going on there and is looking at kind of political corruption and things like that. It moves back and forth in time so we get what was going on with her dad, we get Nora in the present, and we also get the woman who's currently serving the prison sentence, bits of her story. There's lots of interconnected sort of perspectives. And for me, while I thought the themes that were being explored of kind of like the generational trauma of conflict was really interesting, and there were some moments of really beautiful writing, on the whole, it felt like there was far too much plot to be crammed into a book that was only 220 pages long. And it just ended up, you know, when like every single character ends up being connected to every other character, but because it didn't feel like there was really time for those things to be explored in a meaningful way, it ended up feeling like really like convenient rather than sort of cleverly plotted. So that was that. And then the next one I read was Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig. This is my book pick for Austria and was translated from the German by Anthea Bell. So this is a classic novel. This was first published in 1939, and it's got a really interesting nested narrative. So at the start, the narrator meets a man who is like this like lauded war hero, and he meets him one night, and the guy is like, okay, I'll tell you my life story, but like I'm not going to write it down, but we can, you know, we can hang out for one evening and we can have some drinks and I can tell it to you. So that's the setup, and then the rest of the book is this war hero Tony's life as told by him, as interpreted by the original guy. Am I making sense? So like it is told in first person from Tony, the war hero's perspective, but we know because of that initial setup that that's not exactly how Tony said it, and that it has been written and repackaged by the original narrator. And because he's set up in that first initial bit as being a war hero, we think, as a reader, okay, this man's life story is going to be leading towards him going to war. And it sort of is, but it very much isn't. So it's actually, the vast substance of the book is about, prior to him being deployed in the war overseas, he was in barracks and he accidentally on purpose befriended this very rich and influential family, and in particular there was a daughter in that family who was in her early 20s who had suffered some kind of illness in her like early teen years, I think, and as a result of that has lost the use of her legs. And this is where the book title is very on the nose. Because when Tony meets this girl, he's filled with pity for her and her disability and the fact that she can't do all of these things that she used to be able to do, and a lot of his actions end up being driven by this pity that he feels for her, which he thinks is this charitable, kind feeling. But actually ends up being incredibly destructive and ultimately leads towards where the book goes next. And I was at first really unsure about the way that disability was being used, but actually overall I think this is for a book that was written in 1939, and there are aspects of how he talks about how disability is presented that is maybe not how we with today's sensibilities would like, but on the whole I thought it was really interesting thematically to explore that this idea that like pity is a very unhelpful emotion and is not what anyone wants anyone else to feel about their own lived experience, right? So I really liked it for that, and most importantly, it was just very readable. Not a huge amount happens. It is a little bit, you know, drawing room sort of vibes, lots of conversations and things. But I really enjoyed it. I think he's got a really great writing style, and I'll definitely be looking to read more from this author in the future. I mean, I know he's like one of the most famous Austrian authors that there is, so you know. But yeah, I really liked it. I thought it was very, very well written, really, really engaging, and there were moments where I really didn't want to put it down, and actually parts of it where I was more on the edge of my seat and thrilled than the previous political thriller. So there you go, that's that. The next book is the shortest one I read. This is The Passport by Romanian author Herta Müller, which was translated from the Romanian by Martin Chalmers. And this is, so Herta Müller is a director, an author that I've been meaning to read for a while. She's a previous recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature and is incredibly well respected. This is a very short little book. It's set in a German village in Romania during the rule of the Romanian Communist Party, which became the dictatorship. What was his name? Nicolae Ceausescu. So it's during his sort of dictatorship of Romania, and it follows the lives of the people in this village who were kind of caught between this incredibly austere regime, a very bleak way of life, and this kind of dream of the West and the potential release that they might get from being able to move out of Romania. And it's written in these really short, kind of disparate little vignettes. There is a narrative that arcs through it of following this miller called Windich. Can she remember his name? It's not important. Yeah, it follows him as he's trying to get the money and paperwork ready for his family, his wife and daughter, to move across the border into Germany. But they are really short sections, and some of them are following his family, some of them are following different characters, some of them are at that time, some of them are earlier. It's very poetically written. Some of the writing is really beautiful, but it's bleak as fuck. Oh my god, it's so bleak. And like, I have read some bleak European literature this time. I think this might be the bleakest book I've read for this challenge, and it hasn't stayed with me very much, but I do think it suffered from just what else I was reading around the time. I've read quite a lot of short novels now, and actually, like, what I am clamouring for at the end of this Euros challenge is like some big books to just get stuck into. I think I've like had a lot of staccato reading and a lot of like quickly over here, quickly over there, quickly over here. And I just think for me, this book maybe suffered from being like another short book when actually that maybe wasn't really what I should have been reading. So it was like interesting ideas. I would like to read more by her, maybe in a slightly longer form. But yeah, like interesting, like beautiful writing, some interesting ideas, but not a whole lot holding it together for me, which I think, again, if I'd read it at a different time, I might have felt better about that, or more, felt like I might have responded better to it than I did, but there we go. Okay, the next one is The World Goes On by László Krasznahorkai, which is the Hungarian pick, my Hungarian pick, and this is translated from the Hungarian by Ottilie Mulzet and George Szirtes. And this is another incredibly well-respected, well-lauded author. So he's previously won, I think, the International Booker Prize. He's won the National Book Award for Translated Fiction before. I do want to read more of him because this was a short story collection. And if you don't know this about me as a reader, I don't really like short story collections. I really struggle with them. I think for similar reasons that I struggled with the Herta Müller book, actually. But I picked it in a bit of a rush because I had been expecting to read a different Hungarian book by a different author that then, for reasons, was no longer available to me. So I had to like just quickly kind of scrabble and try and find one that I had access to, because I had made this decision that I wasn't going to be buying books just for this Euros challenge. And so I got this one. It was available on Everand, and I just started reading it. And I was about 60 pages in before I realised it was a short story collection. So, parking the fact that it's not my favourite kind of like genre or format, There were really interesting ideas here. I can see why he's a very well sort of awarded author, and I can see that he is an author that I probably would really like to read a novel from. The reason it took me a long time to realise they were short story collections is because the first 2 short stories are a single sentence each, and they run to about 30 pages each, or at least maybe not exactly 30 pages. I was reading on an e-reader, so like the page numbers get a little skewed, but long sentences. And so I didn't know that they were not going to be connected. And thematically, the stories are sort of all connected in some way. There's a lot of, they're very esoteric, they're very intellectual, and they're all kind of permeated with this like huge existential angst. Though long sentences is something that I have encountered in a lot of the books that I read in this European reading challenge. But is something that this author is apparently very renowned for, these incredibly long sentences. And they do really capture this sense of almost like existential intellectual paralysis that a lot of the characters in the stories are experiencing. So like there's one story where this guy who is obsessed with waterfalls and obsessed with hearing waterfalls ends up like very, very drunk in Shanghai, and you're just kind of like following him around Shanghai as he's like musing and getting trapped on this like weird dystopian like road system. So there's books, there's stories kind of like that, and then there's ones that there's like a story that is told through a series of lectures that have a lot more kind of like more overt political commentary to them. And yeah, there was a lot in there. He had a really wry sense of humour. He's clearly a very, very intelligent writer, really interesting, and I do want to read more by him, but like I just can't. Short stories are just not for me, I don't think. So yeah, so there was that one. And then the final Euros book I read was At the Breakfast Table by Defne Suman, which was translated from the Turkish by Betsy Göksel. And this is the book that I had on my shelf that was passed on to me. So my friend Evie had like cleared out her shelves and was like, does anyone want any of these books? And I was like, I'll have that one. Like that looks like a kind of like nice summery cover, and it's been sat on my shelf for about a year. And I didn't know anything about it. When I said, yeah, I'll take that and put that on my shelf. And this is something that I used to do a lot more. It's a bit of a toxic book accumulation habit that I had, where I would just like fill my shelves up with books for the sake of it, rather than like books that I specifically wanted to read. But anyway, I was really pleased that I got to read this as part of the Euros reading challenge. This is a multi-generational family drama that takes place on an island in Turkey, and the family, the various members of this family have all come together because the matriarch has just turned 100 years old, and she's this quite celebrated, used to be very famous artist, and she's always had like a kind of like bit of secrecy around her. And it's her 100th birthday, so her family are coming to the island to celebrate with her. And there's a journalist who is a long-time on-off partner of the niece, the daughter, the great. This is what I needed, a family tree for this book, I swear. The granddaughter of this woman, she has this like on-off relationship with this journalist, so he's there because he's going to be interviewing the artist. Her brother is there, and he's obsessed with finding out what happened to the artist's father, and there's sort of a kind of complex family tree thing happening. But at the outset of the book, the great granddaughter finds that her dad has disappeared in the middle of the night. So the guy who was interested in the great-great-grandfather. God, it's a nightmare to talk about. And he's disappeared, and they don't know where he's gone. And as they try and work out where he's gone, they're uncovering various stories from the past, and things are coming to the surface. It's told with multiple perspectives, I think from about 5 or 6 different perspectives, and I sort of was interested in the central story of it, but I didn't particularly like the way it was told. For me, we chopped and changed a little too much between the perspectives, and there was some really clunky feeling exposition that I just sort of found a bit like, why did you feel the need to tell me that? Like, I wish you'd just shown me that. And it was pretty readable. I think it's like, if you want a kind of like family saga-y book, it would be like a good beach read. It's very summary. But yeah, like it's not going to be a favourite of mine. I found quite a lot of the characters like just supremely unlikable. I can't work out if I was supposed to or not, but definitely like felt a little I felt like I couldn't quite connect to the characters in it, but I think that is because there were too many of them that I was trying to connect with in one go. So there's that. And then before I tell you about the final fiction books I read, I'm going to talk to you about the one other non-fiction that I read this month, which was Small Fires, An Epic in the Kitchen by Rebecca May Johnson. I listened to this on audio and it was read by the author. This is, I've been enjoying, inspired by Raylene from the Books Unbound podcast, I too have been enjoying a kind of food cooking related memoir of late. And this is a really interesting piece of creative nonfiction. So I would recommend it if you're in the market for like a book that's sort of memoir, but like is really going beyond a like straight memoir. This has elements of like food history, particularly looking at like the relationship between culture and food and feminism and food cultures, and also has really personal aspects of memoir, particularly around the author's mental health that she's struggled with. And it sort of defies categorization in quite a few ways. It's a book that like it will appeal to you if, sort of like I was saying about Ali Smith, if you're down for just sort of hearing or reading a very clever, interesting person go down some intellectual rabbit holes that are vaguely food related, you'll get on with it. If you are wanting something that is more linear and mapped out, it's probably not going to be the book for you. I, on the whole, really liked it, but I do wish I hadn't listened on audio and that I had a physical copy of it. Because there was quite a lot of stuff that I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So the largest chunk of the book, she refers back to a few times, this very simple pasta sauce recipe. And at some points in the book, she's trying to like find the history of this recipe. She's trying to find like the person who gave her the recipe, where did they get the recipe from, and where was it first published, and what region of Italy is it from, and if I go to Italy, are they going to make it the same way? And then sometimes she's listing like the ways that she has adapted the recipe, so like different ingredients that she's added or taken away, or the way she's done it, and she's used this recipe almost as like a marker throughout her life to tell you these, like, you get these like little glimpses of her life where she's gone back to this source, and it's almost like this recipe has kept her, has been like a companion throughout the years. It's sort of something that, so she'll be like, I remember when I made this for like this person, or like there's a like different moments in her life when she's reached for this recipe and adapted it in certain ways. And so she's kind of uses that as a frame for not the entire book, but a big chunk of the book uses that. And then there was some really interesting thought-provoking stuff, particularly through at the start of the book, around like the intersection of food and feminism and domesticity, and particularly like how different generations of women relate to each other through food. So this idea that I think it's changed now, but definitely there used to be that like if you were a feminist you shouldn't cook, because like that's what the patriarchy wants you to do. They want you to be stuck in the kitchen. And she had this brilliant line that was like, she explores the nuance of that really, really well. And there was a really good line that was, "It is bad faith to condemn your grandmother's archive because she wasn't as free as you." And like, I just thought it was just really interesting. There were some bits like that I was more into than others. Like, I think when you've got this sort of like style of writer who goes down these different rabbit holes, it's not always surprising necessarily that like I'm not as interested in all of those tangents as other ones. But yeah, I thought it was really thought-provoking. I thought it was really interesting. And some of the like writing was really, really just poetic and beautiful. So yeah, recommend that one if that sounds up your street. If that sounds like a nightmare for you, just don't go near it. Just don't go near it. It's not for you. That's fine. Okay, last few books. I read the Starless by Erin Morgenstern, which was read by a full cast. So I'm not going to list everyone's name because I think there were like loads of people in the cast. And she's an author that I haven't read before but have been meaning to read for a while. And this is like a speculative fiction meets fantasy adventure romance book. So our protagonist finds himself, he's an academic interested in like the intersection of literature and games. And I thought that was like, I was like, straight away I was like, it's like tomorrow. It's not like tomorrow. But he's an academic. He's quite a young academic, but he's an academic, and he finds a book in a library, in one of the university libraries, that doesn't belong there. Doesn't like have like the stamps or whatever. They can't find like a record of it on the system. And from discovering this book, this whole sort of underground magical world is revealed to him that is very much about, it is a world that is about storytelling. And it's going to be really hard for me to describe it because this is like the worst possible book for Hannah Lost the Plot to talk about because there is so much plot. But like it was, let me just press it. What I will say is, for the first like third to a half of this book, I was absolutely loving it. I thought the world building was really interesting. I was really interested in the characters. There were so many layers. So you've got his story, and then there were these other layers of narrative, because the Starless Sea is essentially like, I'm going to get this wrong because I read this quite early this month, but like, it's like the place where stories are made. And there was like fantasy and whimsy to it, but there was a lot of like meta narratives happening. It was like complex and cool. And then it just became too much for me. Like too much meta narrative, too much interconnectedness. The layering just became like really oppressive for me and my enjoyment of the story. So like it was in lots of ways like an ode to storytelling, the importance of storytelling, the way we tell stories about our lives, and I love that and hive that thematically, but just like narratively it just like lost me completely. And I had a bit of an issue with the central romance. So it's got a queer romance at the centre of it, which love that, but I don't know, like there was something about, I loved both of these men individually. They were both really cool characters, but the way the romance was presented and described was always like told, not shown. And so it was like we were told how much these men were drawn to each other, how much they loved each other, but I never really understood why or could see why and that wasn't ever on the page, and it always said, so the romance just felt quite like surface level and a bit like, oh well, they're drawn to each other because that's what the narrative demands, rather than like because I really understand why these characters are drawn to each other. So that was just like my little extra quibble. But I was talking to a couple of people who know my reading taste quite well after reading this, and apparently The Night Circus is going to be like more up my street than this one. But yeah, like I was disappointed because I thought, oh my god, I'm fucking loving this book so much, yay, and then it just totally lost me, which was a shame. And then another book that was like a little bit disappointing, I read M Logan's The Mother, which was read by Gemma Whelan, and I read this because I had to wait because I wanted to buy the final instalment of the Frida Klein series by Nikki French, but there was an issue on Libro FM where the audio file that they had was corrupted, so I couldn't buy it, and it took them, like, customer service was amazing and infinitely better than anything I've ever experienced at an Amazon-owned company. But it did take them a little while to get the publishers to send them the correct audio files through. So while I waited for Nikki French, I was like, what can I listen to? I will listen to some TM Logan because I've listened to a couple of his crime books before and really enjoyed them. This is about a woman who at the start of the book is attending her own funeral. So we know that she is not dead because she is attending her funeral in secret. And the rest of the book is explaining how she ended up there. And so we have this split narrative. So she is a woman who was imprisoned after her husband, who was this up-and-coming, like, young politician, was murdered in their own home while she was asleep upstairs, and their children were asleep upstairs, and she was accused of his murder and sent to prison. So on the one hand, there's a narrative that follows that timeline, so like immediately before he was killed and then the immediate aftermath of, and then there is another timeline that is her as she's just been released from prison and is innocent, or at least she tells us she is innocent, and is trying to work out who actually killed her husband because it wasn't her. And I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it anywhere near as much as I liked The Curfew or The Catch. And I think it's because this one felt a little bigger in scope and a bit more like conspiracy led, whereas I think particularly what The Curfew did so well was like the family drama side of crime thriller, I think is really like where I'm interested, and I'm less like, I was just, yeah, and I really didn't like the actual what had gone on, like the reveal of it, the twist. I just thought was like, So like, I mean, Gemma Whelan does a really good job with the audio performance, but yeah, on the whole, meh. But Tell you what I did really like, Tom Lake by Anne Patchett, which was read by Meryl Streep. So this is the book that I read on Audible because I bought it whenever this book came out, and I found out that Meryl Streep was doing the audiobook. I was like, great, yes, I will buy that. I didn't know anything about what this book was about. I'd never read an Anne Patchett book before, but I was like, I am spending my Audible credit on this for Meryl. And the good news is that really worked out for me because I really liked it. This is told through a series of recollections. It is a mother who was formerly an actor and is now a cherry farmer with her husband, and it is set during lockdown, and her 3 adult daughters are all back at the farm for the pandemic. One is going to be taking over the farm, and the other two have just like come home in order to be like safe and around nature and reasonably, distanced in a less populated area. Goodness me, I've been talking for a while. And they are basically they are eliciting, while they get ready for the cherry harvest, they are getting their mum to tell the story of how she accidentally became an actor, and particularly the story of the affair she had with another actor while she was very young, who then went on to be like a very famous movie star. So like they've known for like since they were teenagers, I think, that their mum had formerly dated this actor before he was famous, but they've never heard the entire story from start to finish. And as they've got all this time, they want her to finally tell the story. So that's what it is. But again, it's another dual timeline. So you are getting, the majority of the book is sort of in the past, is her telling these stories of like from her late teens through to her late 20s, but then you get this big chunk that's like in the present day, and so you're also hearing about her daughters' lives now and their lives now, and the impact that the pandemic is having on them. And I just really loved it. It was incredibly, it felt quite cozy. I thought all of the characters felt really, really real. And I mean, Meryl, just beautiful audiobook narration. I really loved it. It wasn't a perfect book. There were, particularly around some like reveals in the narrative, that I found like don't bear up very well to close examination. Like as soon as you start going, but hang on, like it starts to fall apart a little bit. But I thought the relationships between like mother and daughter and between sisters was really interesting. I like, my partner is an actor, and I'm always interested in books that kind of talk about acting and that feel quite authentic about like what that actual experience is like. And I really recommend it. If you can get the audiobook, I recommend it. I don't think it's an Audible exclusive. And yeah, I recommend it. I thought it was great. I had a lovely time with it. So as preamble to the penultimate book in my May wrap up, I started a themed book club with some friends recently. We haven't met yet. We're actually meeting on Friday. And what I have found is that I really enjoy talking about books with my friends, but we all have quite different reading tastes and styles and like vibes of what we like. And so it's really hard, I think, with a book club, it can often be really difficult to find a book that appeals to everyone equally. It's certainly like issues I've had in like large book clubs before, where like the genres that I read are not necessarily the same as like what other people wanted to read, and then there's always some people that are like a bit like, oh, I don't really want to read that book, but fine. So I have started with a couple of pals a themed book club, and the premise is that we pick a theme for the month, and everyone reads a different book. So you read whatever the fuck you want in response to that theme. So the idea then is that we can all come together and have conversations about a shared theme, but we've all read something that appealed to us and that we wanted to read. And so the first theme that we picked was journeys, and I went super on the nose by picking the Odyssey by Homer. I know this story, or parts of this story, quite well. I've read a lot of things that like intersect with this narrative, but I have never read the Odyssey all the way through, and I was actually kind of surprised by the length of it, because I've read the Iliad, and in my head the Iliad and the Odyssey are the same length, but this is much longer than the Iliad. So, for those who don't know, the Odyssey follows Odysseus, and he is a bloke from from an island called Ithaca, and he tries to avoid going to fight on behalf of the Greeks at the siege of Troy, but he ended up having to go, and so he was 10 years at war at Troy, and then took 10 years, another 10 years, to get back home to his wife and son in Ithaca. And this is the story, essentially, of his journey home. So not the siege of Troy, that stuff has all happened, but his journey home. And it's interesting because this poem is sort of constructed. It's based on like oral forms of storytelling, right? They were called rhapsodes, and they were kind of songs and pieces of oral performance poetry. And what Homer did, whoever Homer was, is sort of arrange lots of different songs and pieces of that oral storytelling tradition into like one epic poem. And so it is a little uneven in how the story bears out, because it's not like it's been written from start to finish. It's kind of pulled from these different versions, so you get different perspectives throughout it. The timeline moves quite a lot. I can now understand and completely appreciate why Margaret Atwood felt the need to write a response to the Odyssey called the Penelopead, which follows Odysseus's wife Penelope, who has been left on this island, because at the start of the Odyssey we find out that basically Odysseus's baby son, who was a baby when he went off to war, is all grown up now and is fucking fuming because basically all these blokes have appeared from all these islands surrounding them to try and make his mum marry them, because they're all like, Odysseus has been gone, like the war finished 10 years ago, he's still not home, he's definitely dead, mate, you're probably gonna want to get another husband. So you get kind of a bit of what's happening there back in Ithaca, a bit of what's happening to Odysseus, and like I'm glad I read it. I didn't love it. I think Odysseus is mostly like really fucking arrogant and annoying. I didn't love him. It is fun to see Athena be like an absolute sap for a mortal. Love that. But yeah, like, I mean, it's a foundational text in like global literature, so like I'm glad I read it, but it was fine. It was fine. I have preferred retellings of it. And then the final book I've read this month is Herc by Phoenicia Rogerson. So we're sticking with classical mythology, but this is very much a modern retelling. And this, as you might be able to tell from the title, is a retelling of the life of Hercules / Heracles, depending on whether you want to give him his Greek or Roman name. And this was interesting. So basically it is about Hercules, but you never hear from him directly. It is like a collage of voices and perspectives of all of the different kind of characters from Greek mythology or Roman mythology that intersect with Hercules' life and their take on him. And it does move chronologically from like his conception through to his death. But it's a lot of voices. I listened to the audiobook of this, which was on Everand, and I think has just been taken off. So, like, I'm sorry if you wanted to listen to it on Everand, but I think they've got rid of it now. I don't know where it is. And it was read by a full cast. And again, this, I think there were like 20 or 30 actors on this. It was a lot of voices. And the one quibble I did have with the audio, it was brilliantly performed and very immersive and very funny, but man, do a lot of these names sound the same. Iphitus and Iphicles, for example, one is his brother, one is his lover. Don't get them confused. So and it had like a list of the characters at the end of the audiobook. And I'm like, well, that's absolutely no use to me, because I could have used that earlier on, but never mind. But yeah, there's a lot of characters, so I recommend pen and paper if you are caring about how they all connect to each other. I sometimes forgot who people were, but it didn't dull my overall enjoyment of the book. And yeah, it is a very modern retelling, as I said. It is feminist, it is queer. But yeah, anyway, because it's this kind of kaleidoscope of opinions of Hercules from like people who knew and loved him. And are kind of like a bit apologists for what he does, right the way through to people who absolutely hate him, loathe him, want him dead. It was a really interesting and kind of like nuanced tapestry that's painted of him. So if you are thinking, if you don't want the version of Hercules from the Disney film to be utterly destroyed, don't read this book. But I did really, I enjoyed the queer rep in it. Hercules, a bit like Achilles, had a couple of very close male friends, and Phoenicia Rogerson kind of like leans into the queer element, makes Hercules bisexual. He has a number of relationships with men and women in the book, which is always fun. And it was like a little bit silly. I don't think it completely worked narratively. I think for me there were a few too many voices, and it did lose. I think by having it be this kind of collage of different voices, that was interesting, but it was quite a long audiobook, and I think it lacked a coherent narrative, and it's difficult because her point, I think, is that there are versions of who Hercules was, that there is no one definitive one, but I think it just lacked a little bit of like narrative punch, particularly like in the last quarter of the book. It just sort of like trickled away a little bit, but it was enjoyable and entertaining, and I had a good time with it. So, my goodness me, that's every book that I read in May. I would love to know what you have read, what the best thing you read this month was. Please let me know in a comment down below. And yeah, if you've read any of these or want to like weigh in with your opinions, then do feel free. And if you could give this video a little thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, that would be really helpful. It really helps the algorithm and people finding my channel and stuff. And yeah, thanks very much, friends. See you all soon.